My name is Emily Carter. I've been a nurse practitioner for over 15 years, dedicating my life to saving others. I need to share something that has haunted me since the day I died. A truth so dark and horrifying that it keeps me awake at night, praying for those who have no idea what truly lurks in the shadows. What I'm about to tell you might be the difference between salvation and eternal darkness for someone listening right now. For most of my career, I believed hospitals were sanctuaries of healing, places where science and compassion triumphed over sickness and death. I never imagined that behind the sterile hallways and gentle reassurances, a sinister battle was being waged for the very souls of the dying. But then I died. And in that moment, Jesus himself revealed a terrifying reality. Demons and witches, unseen by human eyes, swarming around the sick, drawing them into darkness when they were most vulnerable. But before I reveal what Jesus showed me about the darkness hiding in places meant for healing, you need to understand who I was, how I ended up on that hospital bed, and why my experience is a warning to anyone who believes they're safe just because they're surrounded by doctors, nurses, and prayers. What happened that day changed me forever, and if you're willing to listen, it might change you too. I was born in a small town called Assisi, nestled in the heart of Italy. Growing up, the streets were paved with cobblestones, and every corner seemed to echo with the chimes of church bells. My family was devoutly Catholic. My mother never missed Mass, and my father, though stern, would kneel in prayer each night without fail. Sundays were sacred, and our home was filled with the scent of incense and the soft murmur of Latin hymns. Faith wasn't just something we practiced, it was the air we breathed. As a little girl, while other children played in the vineyards or chased each other through the olive groves, I found solace in the church's cool, candlelit aisles. I would sit for hours, eyes fixed on the stained glass windows that painted the stone floors in shades of crimson and gold, listening to the priest's voice rising and falling like waves. Even then, I felt a calling, a gentle but unrelenting pull towards something greater than myself. I thought it was a call to serve God within those walls, perhaps even to take up the veil as a nun one day. I never imagined that my calling would lead me to battle darkness in the very places meant for healing. When I was 14, my mother fell gravely ill. Watching her fade away, helpless and frail, sparked something fierce in me. I spent countless nights by her bedside, praying rosaries until my fingers ached, begging God for a miracle. But the miracle didn't come, at least not the way I expected. Instead, her passing ignited a fire within me to save others from the same fate. I decided to pursue medicine, believing that if I couldn't work miracles, at least I could fight death with science and faith by my side. I excelled in my studies, driven by that singular purpose. By the time I became a nurse practitioner, I had seen my share of suffering, patients clinging to life, families shattered by loss. I prayed silently for each one, believing that my faith acted as a shield against the darkness that seemed to loom over every hospital room. But nothing could have prepared me for the truth that lay hidden beneath the surface, the spiritual warfare raging unseen in the very halls where I fought to save lives. It started subtly, an unexplainable chill in certain rooms, patients who would recover only to relapse suddenly, and whispers, soft and unintelligible, that seemed to echo through empty corridors late at night. I blamed it on stress, on exhaustion from double shifts, and emergency calls. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something sinister prowled those halls, unseen but ever present. I would catch glimpses, shadows that slithered just beyond my vision, eyes that glinted for a heartbeat and then vanished. One evening, as I prepared a patient for surgery, he grasped my wrist with an unnatural strength, eyes wide and pleading. His voice was a rasp, but his words chilled me to the bone. "They're waiting for me. Don't let them take me." His grip was cold as ice. I tried to reassure him, but his eyes stared past me, fixed on something I couldn't see. When he flatlined just minutes later, I stood there, hands trembling, feeling a darkness suffocate the room. It was as if something had been lurking, waiting for that very moment to strike. I convinced myself that it was just the stress of the job, that maybe I was imagining things. But what I saw after I died proved that the darkness was real. And that night was only the beginning. That night at the hospital felt different, thicker, somehow, as if the air itself was woven with shadows. I had just finished my shift and was walking down the corridor when a sudden wave of nausea hit me, so intense I had to grip the wall for support. My vision blurred, and my heart pounded erratically, each beat a desperate fist against my rib cage. A coldness slithered up my spine, far too icy to be natural, and a deep heaviness pressed down on my chest, stealing the air from my lungs. I tried to call for help, but my voice came out as a rasp. My legs gave out beneath me, and I crumpled to the cold, polished floor. The world spun violently, colors smearing into darkness. My fingers twitched uselessly, and my breaths turned shallow and frantic like a bird trapped in a cage. I could feel my heartbeat stuttering, slowing, as if unseen fingers were squeezing the life from it. This can't be happening, I thought, panic roaring in my ears. But then, everything around me dimmed, the hospital lights flickering into shadows. My last conscious thought was a prayer, frantic and broken, as darkness claimed me completely. But death was not the end. I expected oblivion, cold and endless. Instead, I was suddenly aware, more aware than I had ever been before. I hovered above my own body, sprawled lifeless on the hospital floor, eyes half open and glassy. Nurses rushed to my side, shouting for a crash cart, their faces twisted in horror. I should have been terrified, but instead, I felt an eerie calmness, a detachment that made no sense. I could see everything with startling clarity, the beeping monitors, the fluorescent lights, even the tiny crack in the ceiling tile directly above me. But what sent a chill through my very essence was what I saw lurking in the corners of the room. Shadows, thick and seething, with eyes that gleamed like embers. They moved with purpose, circling my body like vultures. And then I saw them, the doctors and nurses trying to revive me, dark silhouettes flickering behind them, whispering, their voices oily and twisted. It wasn't just shadows. As I drifted higher, I saw dark figures in the rooms of other patients, some clawing at the edges of beds, others whispering into ears, their eyes hungry and cruel. It was as if a veil had been pulled back, exposing a world layered over ours, one infested with creatures of darkness, a realm I had been blind to until now. Before I could comprehend what I was seeing, a force, gentle yet unrelenting, grasped hold of me, pulling me upward. I couldn't resist it, couldn't fight it. Weightless and helpless, I soared, leaving the hospital and the dark figures far below. Cold gave way to warmth, and shadows to a brightness that seemed to pulse with life. I moved faster and faster, through a tunnel that seemed to be woven from light itself, soft and iridescent. Voices, distant but harmonious, echoed all around me, each note laced with a love so profound it left me breathless. I wanted to stay there forever, to bask in that warmth and forget the darkness I had seen. And then I saw it, the light. It was not like the sun or any earthly glow. It was alive, vast and boundless, radiating love, wisdom, and power. It didn't blind me. Instead, it enveloped me, sinking into every part of my being. Within that light stood a figure, clothed in white so brilliant it seemed woven from stars. As I drew closer, the figure became clearer, and my spirit quivered with recognition. It was Jesus. His presence was not just light, but life itself, every atom of his being vibrating with love and truth. His eyes, oh, his eyes, were unlike anything on earth. They were a blend of fire and water, fierce yet gentle, holding the vastness of eternity within them. The moment our eyes met, an overwhelming weight of reverence brought me to my knees. I had seen countless depictions of Jesus throughout my life, paintings, statues, stained glass, but none of them captured the living reality of him. He was not just a religious icon. He was alive, dynamic, and his very presence seemed to breathe. In his gaze, I felt completely seen, not as a mother, a nurse, or even as a dying soul, but as I truly was. Every mask I had ever worn, every defense I had ever built, crumbled in an instant. His eyes penetrated past all the labels and roles, reaching into the depths of my essence. I felt exposed, yet unashamed, vulnerable, yet completely safe. I expected judgment, but instead I was met with an unfathomable love, a love that knew every wound, every mistake, and every fear I had ever harbored. Tears, if I still had physical ones, would have streamed down my face. It was as if, for the first time, I understood what it meant to be loved without condition. Then Jesus spoke. His voice was like a melody woven into the light, resonating not just in my ears, but deep within my spirit. "You have walked among shadows, my child," he said. "You have shown kindness and healed the sick, but there were truths hidden from you, truths that only I could reveal." His words were both balm and blade, gentle yet cutting through the fog of my understanding. I had thought I knew him through my prayers, my service, and my acts of compassion. But now, in his presence, I realized how shallow that understanding had been. I had known him through stories and traditions, but I had never truly known him. "You have seen the suffering," he continued, "but not the chains that bound it. You have brought comfort, but not always truth. And there were forces, dark and cunning, that worked where healing should have reigned." A cold realization washed over me. Had I been so focused on the physical world that I had missed the spiritual war raging beneath it? I had seen death as a medical event, a transition of the body, but now I understood it as a battlefield of souls. "The enemy has crept into the places of healing," he said, his expression filled with both sorrow and determination. "And many perish, not just in body but in spirit, because the truth was veiled." My soul trembled as the weight of his words settled upon me. I had seen patients slip away, had comforted grieving families, but I had been blind to the hidden realm where demons prowled and witches whispered. I had believed that death was a natural end, but now I saw it as a moment of profound vulnerability where darkness could seize those unprepared. It was as if a veil had been torn from my eyes. I could feel truth flooding into me, not as knowledge but as revelation. Everything I thought I knew about life, death, and the spiritual realm shifted beneath me, like sand under a rising tide. Jesus' gaze held mine, a mixture of sorrow and urgency in his eyes. His hand extended toward me, and the light around us seemed to pulse with anticipation. In an instant, the scene shifted, and I was no longer standing in the brilliance of his presence. I was in a hospital corridor, one I recognized all too well, the same pale green walls, the faint scent of antiseptics, the muffled beeping of monitors from nearby rooms. But something was different. The air was heavy, charged with a darkness that seemed to cling to my skin. I found myself moving down the hallway, not walking but almost gliding, unseen by the nurses rushing past. I tried to speak, to ask what was happening, but no sound came out. My gaze was drawn to a room at the end of the corridor, room 317. The door was slightly ajar, and an unnatural chill seeped into the hallway. As I peered inside, I saw her, Mrs. Callahan, an elderly woman I had cared for. She lay motionless, her frail body barely causing a ripple in the white hospital sheets. But it wasn't her stillness that sent a chill down my spine. It was what stood beside her bed, a figure cloaked in shadows. Its form indistinct, yet undeniably malevolent, hovered over her. It was neither doctor nor nurse. Its presence was wrong, a distortion in reality itself. I tried to move, to intervene, but my feet might as well have been cemented to the floor. The figure leaned in, skeletal fingers brushing the air above Mrs. Callahan's chest. Instantly, her face contorted in pain, though her eyes remained closed. The monitor beside her flickered erratically, and a low, unnatural hum filled the air, vibrating through my bones. It was a sound no machine could make, a frequency that seemed to resonate with something dark and ancient. I struggled to breathe, my chest tightening as I watched. The shadows seemed to draw something out of her, an essence, a light, draining it slowly. My mind raced with disbelief. This was impossible. I wanted to tell myself it was a nightmare, some twisted hallucination, but every detail was too vivid, too real. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the shadow snapped its head in my direction. Though it had no eyes, I felt its gaze pierce straight through me, freezing me in place. The darkness around it pulsed, spreading like ink in water, and I knew, without a doubt, that it was aware of me. My heart pounded in my ears as a whisper slid into my mind, not a sound but a thought, slick and poisonous. "You do not belong here." And just like that, the figure vanished, leaving only a cold void in its wake. The room fell silent, the monitors returning to their steady beeps, but the darkness lingered. I staggered back, clutching the doorframe for support, my spirit trembling. The truth struck me hard. Death was not just a passing. It was a battlefield, and hospitals were ground zero. Unseen forces moved where life and death hung in the balance, preying on the vulnerable, unseen by eyes blinded by science alone. I turned, my breath shaky, and there stood Jesus, his eyes filled with compassion and fierce resolve. "You see now," he said softly, "there is more at stake than you knew, but there is more to see." And before I could process what had just happened, the scene shifted again. And in that moment, the world around me blurred and shifted, and I found myself standing once again in a hospital, but this time in the pediatric ICU. It was past midnight, and the sterile, white walls seemed almost suffocating. The sound of machines whirring and beeping in the distance was strangely muffled, as though the world itself held its breath. I stood at the entrance of a dimly lit room, watching as a team of doctors worked tirelessly on a little boy, only 6 years old. His name was Elijah, a sweet child whose parents I had seen so often in the waiting room, praying for their son's recovery after a severe car accident had left him on life support. Elijah's body was bruised and battered, his small chest barely rising with each struggling breath. His vitals were unstable, and despite all efforts, his condition was rapidly deteriorating. It felt like an eternity in that room, the weight of helplessness hanging over the team like a dark cloud. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, something beyond what was visible in this sterile clinical setting. That's when I noticed it. A dark figure stood by the far side of the room, shrouded in shadows. It didn't belong. It wasn't human. It wasn't anything I had ever encountered before in my years as a medical professional. The figure was tall, thin, its body shifting in the flickering light. It exuded an aura of coldness, its presence suffocating and oppressive. I stepped closer, almost against my will, drawn to it. But the closer I got, the more I felt the atmosphere shift, an unnatural heaviness pressing in on me. The nurses and doctors around me were unaware, too caught up in their attempts to revive Elijah, but I couldn't ignore it. I could feel the energy of the room changing, the air growing thick with an invisible force. Elijah's heart monitor beeped erratically, and his fragile body trembled as if caught in a seizure. But then there was something more. A faint, high-pitched sound, barely audible to the human ear, seemed to emerge from nowhere, a haunting melody that made my blood run cold. The figure moved closer to the boy, its shadow stretching unnaturally long across the floor. A voice, not spoken aloud, but felt deep within my mind, whispered, "The time is near. His soul belongs to us." The words struck me like a lightning bolt. I knew immediately this was no ordinary situation. I had walked the corridors of hospitals my whole life, trained to deal with the most advanced medical crises. But this was something else entirely. This was spiritual warfare. I looked to the doctors, desperate to find any sign that they were aware of the malignant force standing beside the boy. But they were oblivious, their hands working tirelessly to save him, not knowing the true battle taking place just inches away. The little boy's eyes flickered, and for a brief moment, he seemed to look directly at me, a deep, pleading terror in his gaze. It was as if he was aware of the evil standing over him, but couldn't escape it. The darkness seemed to pulse with a cruel anticipation. I had to do something. I closed my eyes, feeling the weight of everything pressing on me. My heart raced, my mind a blur of thoughts, but I knew what I had to do. I began to pray silently, calling on the name of Jesus, pleading for his intervention. I couldn't fight this darkness on my own, but I knew the power of his name was my shield. In that moment, a wave of warmth of light seemed to radiate from within me, piercing the oppressive atmosphere in the room. The shadow shrieked, though it was not a sound I heard, but felt as if the darkness itself recoiled from the light. The air shifted again, the weight lifting slightly, and Elijah's heart monitor gave a hopeful beep. But it wasn't over. I knew that something far more sinister had been released into the world, something that hid in the shadows of hospital rooms, preying on the souls of the vulnerable. And as the darkness retreated, I saw something else. Standing by the door, watching, was another figure, an old woman, her face sharp and lined with age, but her eyes glimmered with malice. She smiled, and I felt a cold shiver travel down my spine. "This one is ours now," she murmured, her voice low and serpentine, as though she had been there all along, waiting. Before I could act, she vanished as quickly as she had appeared, leaving only an unsettling sense of dread behind. I stood there, frozen in place, my heart pounding in my chest. Elijah's condition had stabilized for the moment, but the battle I had just witnessed, had it been won? Or was this just the beginning? I turned to Jesus, who was still beside me, his expression filled with quiet sorrow. "This is the war you cannot see, child. The souls of the lost are under constant siege, and those who suffer in hospitals in their most vulnerable moments are prime targets. But there is hope. There is always hope." As his words hung in the air, I felt my surroundings shift, the hospital room I was standing in blurring and melting away like a painting dissolving under the heat of a flame. The walls of sterile white faded, and I found myself standing in a corridor that felt oppressively thick, like the very air was weighed down by darkness. It was the last night I spent in the hospital before my death, before everything changed. I was walking through the hallways, the fluorescent lights buzzing above, when I felt it, a suffocating heaviness in the air. It was as though the walls themselves were closing in around me, each step I took echoing with a strange resonance. The usual sounds of the hospital, the beep of monitors, the murmur of nurses, seemed distant and muffled. The world around me had become too quiet, too still. Suddenly, a sharp pain shot through my chest, so intense that I gasped for breath. My heart began to race, hammering against my ribs as though it were trying to escape from my body. I stumbled forward, clutching my chest, and the darkness began to creep in from the edges of my vision. It felt like someone was watching me, something old, something malicious. The pressure in the air thickened, like an unseen hand was squeezing the life from me. I reached for the nearest nurse's station, but before I could move, the world spun. The floor seemed to tilt beneath me, and I collapsed. My body hit the cold, unforgiving tile with a sickening thud, my breath shallow, my heart pounding in my ears. I could feel it then. Something was pulling at my soul. I could hear whispers in the distance, distorted voices laced with malice. They came from nowhere and everywhere, growing louder and louder, swirling around me. They spoke in a language I could not understand, their words slicing through the silence like a blade. But then I saw it. A figure materialized in front of me, its form dark and formless, a mere shadow against the cold light of the hospital. It had no shape, no face, just an oppressive presence that seemed to suffocate the very air. It was massive, towering over me, and as it moved closer, I felt an icy coldness spread through my limbs. The whispers intensified, growing into a low growl that reverberated through my bones. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, as if my body was frozen in place by the sheer force of its power. The figure stretched its hand toward me, and in that instant, I saw flashes, visions of death, of other souls bound in hospitals, caught in the same grip of darkness. There were others. I saw their faces, patients in various states of illness, their eyes wide with terror. They, too, were trapped in this twisted, spiritual web, unaware of the true battle raging around them. Nurses, doctors, and staff moved about, going through the motions of their daily work, completely oblivious to the forces that sought to claim the souls of the vulnerable. I could feel their fear, their confusion, like a collective scream vibrating through the air. The energy around me was thick with this unseen battle, a war fought in the spiritual realm while the living walked unaware of the true darkness lurking just beneath the surface. And then I saw them. They were everywhere. I watched as shadowy, twisted forms, demons, dark spirits, and witches, gathered in the unseen corners of the hospital, manipulating the lives of the sick, whispering words of death and despair into their ears. They circled the beds of the vulnerable, feeding on their fear, their pain, their hopelessness. These dark entities were no mere figments of imagination. They were real, and they were orchestrating the deaths of so many, using their power to steer the souls of the dying toward an eternity of darkness. In the far corner of the room, I saw a woman, her face hidden beneath a black veil, her movements jerky and unnatural. She was chanting, her voice rising in an eerie crescendo, her hands hovering over the lifeless body of a patient, whose chest barely rose with each breath. The woman's eyes gleamed with an unnatural light, her fingers twitching as she twisted the air around her, weaving a spell that seemed to cling to the dying like a poison. But then, just as the darkness seemed to close in, I felt a warmth, a brilliant golden light that began to pierce through the shadows, pushing them back with its power. Jesus was beside me. His presence was overwhelming, and the dark forces recoiled, hissing as they fled before him. He raised his hand, and the room was filled with the sound of chains snapping, of darkness being driven out by the light. The oppressive figures began to disintegrate, their forms melting into the air like smoke, disappearing into nothingness. The whispers stopped, and the silence that remained was deafening in its finality. Jesus spoke again, his voice like a balm to my soul. "This is the reality, child. The battle is not of flesh and blood, but of principalities and powers, of forces unseen. But take heart, for I have overcome. You are not alone. You never were." The darkness that had surrounded me moments before was utterly powerless here. I wanted nothing more than to remain, to never again feel the cold grip of fear or the weight of my earthly struggles. But deep within, I knew this peace was not mine to keep, not yet. Jesus' voice was gentle but unyielding, each word radiating with authority. Your mission is not yet complete, child, he said, his gaze holding mine. You must return and warn them. Tell them what you have seen, the darkness that prowls in places meant for healing, the battles unseen by human eyes. My heart ached at the thought of leaving his side. The time is shorter than many believe. He continued. They think they have years, but the sands are running swiftly. Many walk in shadows, unknowing of the chains that bind them. You must show them the light. His words struck deep, igniting a fire within me that burned with a divine urgency. Images flashed before my eyes. Faces of the lost, eyes hollow with hopelessness, souls ensnared by unseen chains. Hospitals, streets, churches filled with people seeking answers, unaware of the true battle raging around them. I saw nurses, doctors, patients, each surrounded by shadows, their spirits weary and unaware. They must understand. Jesus said, his voice a blend of sorrow and command. You have seen the darkness that hides in plain sight, the demons and witches that surround the sick and the dying, feeding on despair, steering souls into darkness at the final breath. My knees trembled beneath the weight of what he was asking, the sheer enormity of the mission. But as his hand rested upon my shoulder, strength surged through me, a power not my own. The fear, the hesitation, the doubt, all melted away in the light of his presence. I will go, I whispered, voice shaking but resolute. I will tell them everything. You will not go alone, he assured me. My spirit will guide you. Speak boldly, for the truth must be told before the hour is too late. The brightness began to fade, and a deep chill swept over me, as though a door was closing. Jesus' hand slipped from my shoulder, and I felt myself being pulled backward, the light receding faster and faster until only his eyes remained, burning like twin stars in the darkness. Remember, child, his voice echoed, distant yet clear. Tell them what you have seen. The battle is real, and time is running out. In an instant, the warmth vanished, replaced by a crushing cold. When my eyes fluttered open, I was back in my body, every nerve alight with pain and urgency. I struggled to sit up, ignoring the nurse's protests and the burn in my chest. I needed to speak. I needed to tell them. But my words came out in broken whispers, choked by the gravity of what I had seen. There are demons, witches, curses, right here in hospitals. I rasped, my eyes wild. You need to pray. Cover yourselves in the blood of Jesus. Some recoiled. Others exchanged uneasy glances, whispering about the trauma and the drugs. But I couldn't stop. I spoke to anyone who would listen, patients, visitors, even doctors who looked down at me with polite disbelief. I warned them of the curses spoken by those harboring bitterness, of the dark spirits that prey on despair. I recounted how Jesus had shown me nurses and doctors, some unwitting, others complicit, whose actions served a sinister purpose. How a whispered curse could cloak itself as a kind word, how the intent behind a prayer could twist it into a channel for darkness. I spoke of the unseen battles, of how negative emotions from visitors could wrap around the sick, draining their will to fight. Not everyone believed me, but some did. I saw it in the way hands clasped tighter in prayer, in the desperate, tear-streaked faces of mothers who began to whisper the name of Jesus over their children's beds. Even some of the nurses began to pray quietly as they moved from room to room, their eyes darting to shadows that seemed deeper than they should have been. But the resistance was palpable. I was labeled delusional, the drugs blamed for my outbursts. Security was called more than once to escort me back to my room, to silence my warnings. But I wouldn't be silenced. The burden of what I had seen was too great, the urgency in Jesus' eyes too searing to ignore. I knew I couldn't fight alone, so I began to write it all down, pouring the visions into pages that trembled in my hands. I contacted pastors, prayer groups, anyone who might understand. I spoke of how bitterness, anger, and hopelessness were not just emotions but gateways, how curses spoken over patients could cling to them, unseen but deadly. I warned that our words and prayers hold power, that the hospital rooms weren't just battlefields for the body but for the soul, that every prayer of faith, every scripture spoken aloud, could push back the darkness, could sever the unseen chains coiled around the dying. And now I'm telling you, the darkness is real. The battle is real. Evil isn't always obvious. Sometimes it wears a comforting face or whispers in the voice of a loved one. You must pray. Pray without ceasing. Cover yourselves and your loved ones in the blood of Jesus. Ask for discernment. Ask to see the unseen. Time is shorter than you think. Share this message. Comment below where you're watching from, and let others know. We cannot fight what we refuse to see.